Here we're going to take a look at an example of a class I came up with in LabVIEW OOP to handle making groups of controls act as an array. This is extremely useful for things like XControls, which can't actually be contained in an array. So if I go ahead and run this demo application, we see I can create elements within this view right here, and the data reflected in the array of XControl data. So here we can see this is the XControl that I'm using right here, and XControls have their data cluster, and that's what I have the actual array of over here. But the benefit of an XControl is if I have things that I need to have pop-up windows or some more advanced behavior that I want associated with specific controls in a data type, or I want to mix indicators and controls, I can do that with an XControl. But again, you can't have an XControl in an array. But if I continue to add elements to this, we're starting to see how these three elements here are behaving like an array. I can scroll through them, and they reflect the data that's contained in this array. Another thing I can do is I can also, let me change something in this array. So if I programmatically change this array in code, it would then be reflected in my XControl display. So this does a couple of things, and the main controller of all of this is this class, as I stated. So I have a VI in this class, which is create instance, and this takes an array of these separate controls on my front panel that I'm going to be displaying my values in. So I actually have three different XControls on this front panel. So if I stop this, I can go ahead and take this guy. Let me lock it to. I can take this guy, and we can see that there are three different elements in here. And in the background, I just have a decoration for the container. I've got a separate numeric vertical scroll bar here on the right. And then I've manually also created this array that contains my XControls data cluster that's going to back my data in the background. Now this would typically be something that we can hide the control for, and now the user doesn't know that there's a separate control in the background. But of course that's necessary for this to work. So I'm creating references for my three front panel XControls, creating a reference for the scroll bar, and then a reference for that array that's storing the XControl data. I pass that into my initialization function for my control array class, and it gives me out a reference for that. I then, in parallel, run this function, which contains the event loop that listens for all of the scroll bar changes, all of the value change events on my XControls, and handles all that and makes it behave like an array. This is pretty much where most of the heavy lifting goes. I've also got some separate utility functions, which if we bring up the context help, this allows me to add elements to the array, and I can add them at specific positions. And this basically just wraps an insert into array function in the background. So this VI behaves exactly like this one, with the difference that it will put the element I specify at the end of the array if I don't specify an index. I can also remove elements at a specific index. And then once I'm done with the application, in order to get this guy to finish running, since it is in a loop, I've got this function which sends an event to this guy to stop. So I can go ahead and remove all of these. I'm going to add 3 of them. We'll make the middle one 5 minutes, which is at index 1, since indexes are 0 based. And if I remove that one, You can see we're left with the two that had the 1-minute log rates. There are a couple of caveats to using this. If I look at the block diagram for my XControls, in your data change event on your XControl facade VI, you can't really do too much. And the reason for that is on this front panel, every time you move the scroll bar, it's going to end up calling this data change event. And this is how the front panel values on the XControl are being updated. So that's how these are getting updated. So when I scroll here, even without letting up on the mouse, you can see these test numbers are changing, and which ones are currently running and which ones are stopped are progressing through. So since this gets called so frequently, you really don't want to do anything important or anything that takes a long time in your data change event, because that will cause issues. That's pretty much the only thing you'll need to handle in here. On your data cluster, which is not opening correctly since it's running, in your data cluster, you're really going to want more here than you probably normally would with an XControl, because you're also going to need to keep track of things that define the visual state. This is completely broken now. Ooh, don't do that. Where'd my XControl go? There it is. Okay. Because this is the cluster that's getting sent into the XControls every time we scroll. So anything that's needed to recreate any of the look and feel of what's going on will need to be in your data cluster. Sometimes a lot of that would go in your state cluster, but in fact, for this implementation, what I'm doing, I'm going to have to move some of this into my data cluster, since we're not passing this state cluster around. Other than that, it's pretty simple. So again, there are only 5 VIs in this class that are needed. There's the initialize. If I want to, for instance, make this have 4 elements in here, what I can do is create a copy, and I'll just get it all lined up nice and fancy like. I'm going to resize this just to be a little closer to the correct size. And now if I extend this to a 4th element, create my reference, wire that in, which I can't because I need to close this first, because I had something open from the XControl. So now if, yes, I know it is, okay, so let's save all, see if that unlocks it. Oh, I have my automatic tool selection turned off. Okay, so now we've got that figured out. Now this will work exactly like a 4-element array. And all I had to do was put that 4th control reference in. So here we can see now it's working with all 4. So it's really easy to expand on the functionality of this. Again, going to 5 is pretty trivial. Nope, that's not what I wanted. I don't need a variable, I need a reference. And this time I know I need to turn on tool selection. And now there are 5 visible elements. So it's really extensible, and there is nothing inside of this control array class that knows anything about this specific XControl. If I really wanted to, I could do this with a couple of numeric controls. Create references for these, pass them in, and then I would need an array of numerics in the background to store the actual data. So for regular data types, regular clusters, this would be a little bit silly because you could just use a regular array, but this is extremely useful for XControls which can't be placed in an array. If you try and place an XControl inside of an array, it doesn't even let you attempt to do it. It will not drop it in there.